Chapter 1. The Emperor's Solitary Reflections. The Birth of the Meditations. The fire crackles softly in the imperial tent as the most powerful man in the world sits alone with his thoughts. Outside, the Germanic tribes stir restlessly beyond the Danube frontier, their torches flickering like distant stars in the darkness. Inside, Marcus Aurelius dips his reed pen in ink and begins to write, not laws or military orders, but the intimate conversations of his soul. These are the moments that would give birth to one of humanity's most profound philosophical works, though he could never have imagined that his private journal would echo through the centuries. Born Marcus Annius Verus, in the year 121, during the reign of Hadrian, he entered a world at the height of its glory. Rome stretched from the Scottish highlands to the deserts of Syria, from the Atlantic shores of Portugal to the banks of the Euphrates. The empire pulsed with the rhythm of commerce, learning, and unprecedented prosperity. Yet for all its magnificence, this was also a world balanced on the edge of a knife, where plague, war, and the constant pressure of barbarian migrations threatened to topple the greatest civilization the world had ever known. The boy who would become emperor was raised in privilege, yet shaped by loss. His father died when Marcus was young, leaving him to be adopted by his grandfather and later by Antoninus Pius, the reigning emperor. This early experience of mortality and change would profoundly influence his philosophical outlook. In the marble halls of the imperial palace, surrounded by tutors and courtiers, he learned not just the arts of rhetoric and law, but the deeper questions that would haunt him throughout his life. What is the nature of duty? How should one face suffering? What remains when everything we cherish is swept away by time? His education was extraordinary even by the standards of the Roman elite. The finest minds of the age gathered around him, introducing him to the teachings of the Stoics, those remarkable philosophers who had emerged from the ruins of Greek independence to offer a new way of understanding human existence. From Epictetus, the former slave who had found freedom in philosophy, Marcus learned that true liberty comes not from external circumstances, but from mastery over one's own thoughts and reactions. From the earlier Stoic masters like Chrysippus and Zeno, he absorbed the radical idea that the universe itself is rational, governed by a divine logos that weaves all things into a coherent, beautiful whole. Yet philosophy for Marcus was never merely academic. As he grew into manhood, the weight of imperial destiny settled upon his shoulders like a heavy cloak. Antoninus Pius, recognizing the young man's exceptional character, groomed him carefully for rule. Marcus learned statecraft and military strategy, but more importantly, he grappled with the moral dimensions of absolute power. How does one wield authority over millions without becoming corrupted by it? How does one make decisions that affect countless lives while remaining true to one's principles? When Antoninus died in 161, Marcus ascended to the purple at the age of 40. The empire he inherited seemed stable and prosperous, but beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. The Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, began its deadly sweep across the Mediterranean world, killing perhaps 5 million people. Germanic tribes pressed against the northern frontiers with increasing urgency, driven by population pressures and climate changes that made their traditional lands less hospitable. The Parthian Empire in the east remained a constant threat, its heavy cavalry and skilled archers always ready to contest Roman dominance. Marcus found himself emperor not during Rome's golden age of peace, but at the beginning of what historians would later recognize as the empire's long, slow decline. The philosophical principles he had studied in the quiet of the classroom now had to be tested in the harsh crucible of real-world governance. Could Stoic virtue survive the compromises and brutal necessities of imperial rule? Could a philosopher king actually govern effectively, or would his idealism prove a dangerous weakness? The answers to these questions would emerge not in the comfortable libraries of Rome, but in the harsh campaigns along the Danube frontier. For much of his reign, Marcus would find himself far from the capital, leading armies against the Marcomanni, Quadi, and other Germanic confederations that threatened the empire's northern borders. It was here, in the mud and blood of military camps, surrounded by the constant presence of death and the endless pressures of command, that he began his most famous work. The Meditations were never intended for publication. They were private notes, spiritual exercises written in Greek rather than Latin, the language of his philosophical education rather than his political responsibilities. In these pages, we find not the public pronouncements of an emperor, but the intimate struggles of a man trying to live according to his principles in an often brutal and unforgiving world. They reveal a ruler who was simultaneously the most powerful person alive and profoundly aware of his own limitations, mortality, and the ultimate insignificance of worldly achievement. Writing by candlelight after long days of military planning and political negotiation, Marcus poured his soul onto papyrus. He wrestled with anger, frustration, and disappointment. He reminded himself constantly of Stoic principles, not because he had mastered them, but because he struggled daily to embody them. These meditations became his anchor in a world of constant crisis and change, a way of processing the terrible responsibilities of his position while maintaining his humanity and moral compass. The emperor who emerges from these pages is neither the marble statue of later commemoration nor the purely intellectual philosopher of academic study, but a flesh and blood human being grappling with universal challenges. He faces the death of beloved children, the betrayal of trusted friends, the endless demands of duty that pull him away from the life of contemplation he would have preferred. Yet through it all, he maintains an extraordinary commitment to virtue, justice, and service to the common good. His reign lasted 19 years, and for much of that time, he was away from Rome, defending the frontiers that protected millions of people he would never meet. He died in 180, not in the comfort of his palace, but in a military camp near modern-day Vienna, still fighting to preserve the civilization he had inherited. His son Commodus succeeded him, beginning a period of decline that would eventually lead to the empire's transformation and ultimate fall. Yet Marcus left behind something far more enduring than any military victory or political achievement. In his private journal, he created a work of profound spiritual insight that speaks as directly to us today as it did to him nearly 2,000 years ago. The Meditations offer not easy answers or comforting platitudes, but the hard-won wisdom of someone who faced life's greatest challenges with courage, dignity, and an unwavering commitment to doing what is right regardless of personal cost. As we prepare to journey through his thoughts, we encounter not an ancient relic, but a living voice, speaking across the centuries about the eternal human struggles with mortality, duty, and the search for meaning. His words carry the weight of experience earned in the crucible of absolute responsibility, yet they remain accessible to anyone willing to engage seriously with life's fundamental questions. Chapter 2: The Architecture of Gratitude. Lessons from those who shaped an emperor. Marcus begins his private reflections not with grand philosophical declarations or imperial proclamations, but with something far more intimate and revealing. He opens his personal journal by acknowledging his debts to others, creating what amounts to a profound meditation on how character is formed through relationship. This is not mere social courtesy or political calculation, but a genuine recognition that even an emperor exists within a web of influence and obligation that extends back through generations. From his great-grandfather Verus, Marcus learned the importance of good morals and the government of his temper. This was not abstract moral philosophy, but practical wisdom about emotional regulation that would prove essential for someone who would face the pressures of absolute power. The ability to remain calm in the face of provocation, to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively, forms the foundation of all ethical leadership. In acknowledging this debt, Marcus reveals an understanding that character is not innate but cultivated through example and practice. His grandfather gave him lessons in dignity and the avoidance of anger. These were not formal lessons, but the quiet modeling that occurs when someone observes how another person carries themselves through life's inevitable frustrations. Dignity, in the Stoic understanding, is not about status or external recognition, but about maintaining one's inner composure regardless of external circumstances. The avoidance of anger does not mean suppressing natural emotions, but rather not allowing those emotions to control one's actions or judgment. From his father, Marcus learned modesty and a manly character. This combination suggests something crucial about authentic masculinity in the ancient world. True strength was not about domination or aggression, but about the ability to remain humble despite one's position and to act with courage when action was required. Modesty keeps power in perspective, while a manly character ensures that one does not shrink from difficult duties. His great-grandfather Verus also taught him to avoid the schools of the rhetoricians and not to write on speculative matters. This reveals a practical orientation toward philosophy that would characterize Marcus throughout his life. Rather than engaging in abstract debates for their own sake, he was drawn to philosophy as a guide for living. The emphasis on avoiding speculation suggests a preference for what can be tested through experience over what merely sounds clever in argument. The lesson about not attending gladiator games, cockfighting, and other such diversions speaks to the formation of character through the conscious choice of what to pay attention to. These entertainments, popular though they were, coarsened the spirit and habituated the mind to finding pleasure in conflict and suffering. For someone who would need to make life and death decisions affecting millions, such mental habits would be spiritually toxic. Learning to endure labor, to want little, and to work with his own hands reveals a philosophy of life that ran directly counter to the privileges of his birth. These were not just abstract virtues, but practical skills that connected him to the common human experience of earning one's bread through effort. The ability to work with one's hands creates a different relationship to material goods and to other people than a life of pure luxury and delegation. Not meddling with other people's affairs unless required by the common good shows an early understanding of the proper boundaries of authority and concern. This principle would prove essential for governing an empire where the temptation to micromanage or interfere could easily overwhelm any single person. It also suggests a respect for the autonomy and dignity of others that forms the foundation of just governance. The practice of not readily listening to slanders reflects both practical wisdom about the corrupting effect of gossip and deeper insight into human nature. Those in power are constantly exposed to whispered accusations and insinuations, often from people seeking to advance their own interests by undermining others. The ability to distinguish between legitimate concerns and mere malice requires both emotional discipline and careful judgment about sources and motivations. From Diognetus, Marcus learned to avoid being absorbed in trifling pursuits and to be skeptical of the stories told by miracle workers and magicians about incantations and the expelling of demons. This represents a remarkably modern scientific attitude, emphasizing the importance of critical thinking over superstition. In an age when supernatural explanations were readily accepted for natural phenomena, this intellectual independence was both unusual and valuable. The lesson about not keeping quails for fighting or becoming passionately interested in such things again speaks to the formation of character through conscious attention. What we choose to find entertaining shapes who we become. The mind that finds pleasure in watching creatures tear each other apart for sport is being trained in values that are fundamentally incompatible with justice and compassion. Learning to speak freely without regard for whether his words would please others reveals a commitment to honesty that was dangerous for someone in his position. Courtiers and subordinates naturally tell those in power what they want to hear rather than what they need to know. The ability to speak truth and to encourage others to do the same requires both courage and the wisdom to distinguish between honest disagreement and mere flattery. From Rusticus, Marcus learned to read carefully and not be satisfied with a superficial understanding of things. This intellectual discipline of going beneath surface appearances would prove essential for someone who needed to understand complex political, military, and social situations. The habit of careful reading also reflects a deeper commitment to truth over convenience, to understanding reality as it actually is rather than as we might wish it to be. He also learned from Rusticus not to be led astray by the passion for rhetoric, which had become something of an end in itself in Roman education. The ability to argue eloquently could easily become a substitute for actually having something worth saying. This lesson encouraged a focus on substance over style, on what is true and useful rather than what merely sounds impressive. The practice of not parading about in ceremonial dress or engaging in other displays designed to make an impression reflects an understanding that true authority comes from character rather than symbols. While ceremony certainly has its place in governance, becoming dependent on external displays of power suggests an insecurity about the reality of one's authority. True confidence allows one to be effective without needing constant reinforcement through ritual and display. Learning not to compose speeches for show or to display himself as someone who practices great disciplines or performs benevolent acts for the applause of others reveals insight into the corrupting effect of performance on genuine virtue. When good actions are done primarily for recognition rather than because they are right, they cease to be genuinely good and become instead a form of sophisticated selfishness. From Apollonius, Marcus learned freedom combined with caution, and not to leave anything to chance in the smallest matters. This balance between independence and prudence reflects the kind of practical wisdom necessary for effective leadership. Freedom without caution leads to recklessness, while caution without freedom leads to paralysis. The combination allows for bold action when necessary while maintaining careful attention to detail and consequence. The lesson about maintaining the same disposition, whether in pain or pleasure, in fame or dishonor, in death or in life, points toward the Stoic ideal of emotional equilibrium. This does not mean becoming emotionally flat or indifferent, but rather not allowing external circumstances to determine one's inner state or fundamental values. The person who can maintain their character regardless of whether things are going well or poorly has achieved a kind of inner freedom that no external force can touch. Learning cheerfulness in times of apparent defeat and the ability to maintain friendships without becoming either arrogant toward inferiors or servile toward superiors reveals sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. Cheerfulness in defeat is not denial, but rather the recognition that external setbacks need not destroy one's inner peace or fundamental purpose. Maintaining genuine friendship across social hierarchies requires the ability to see others as fellow human beings rather than as functions of their social roles. The capacity for intense application to reading and inquiry without ostentation shows intellectual humility combined with genuine curiosity. The person who studies primarily to impress others with their learning has missed the point of education entirely. True learning changes the learner, making them more capable of understanding and navigating reality effectively. From Sextus, Marcus learned benevolence, the example of a family governed by natural affection, and the concept of living according to nature. These lessons provided both personal warmth and philosophical framework. Benevolence is not mere sentiment, but an active orientation toward promoting human flourishing. A family governed by natural affection provides a model for how relationships can function when based on genuine care rather than mere obligation or convenience. The idea of living according to nature, central to Stoic philosophy, does not mean following every impulse or desire, but rather aligning oneself with the rational order that underlies reality. For humans, this means exercising the distinctively human capacity for reason, choice, and ethical reflection. It means recognizing our social nature while also developing our individual character. Learning gravity without affectation shows the difference between genuine dignity and mere pretension. Gravity comes from taking life seriously without taking oneself too seriously. It reflects a proper sense of the weight of one's responsibilities, combined with humility about one's own limitations and mortality. The lesson about careful attention to the interests of friends, Tolerance of ignorant persons and those who form opinions without investigation reveals both loyalty and patience as essential virtues. Friendship requires active attention and care, not mere sentiment. Tolerance of ignorance and hasty judgment reflects understanding that most people are doing the best they can with limited information and experience. His approach to those who professed Stoic principles was neither dismissive nor uncritically accepting, but rather focused on their character and actions rather than their philosophical labels. This practical wisdom recognizes that what matters is how people actually live rather than what philosophical school they claim to follow. From Alexander the grammarian, Marcus learned to refrain from fault-finding and not to chide those who used barbarous or solecistic expressions, but to engage in proper discourse while naturally introducing the correct form. This teaching method, which corrects through positive example rather than harsh criticism, reflects both effectiveness and kindness. People learn better when they feel supported rather than attacked. The principle of answering according to what was asked, not according to some other agenda, shows respect for others and clarity of purpose in communication. This requires both listening carefully and speaking precisely, skills that are essential for anyone in a position of responsibility. From Fronto, Marcus observed how much envy, duplicity, and hypocrisy are found in those who hold absolute power, and how generally those who are called patricians are rather deficient in natural affection. These observations about power and privilege provided crucial insight into the corrupting effects of elevated status. Power tends to isolate people from honest feedback while surrounding them with those who have their own agendas. Privilege can create emotional distance from the common human experiences that generate empathy and compassion. Understanding these dangers did not make Marcus cynical, but rather cautious about his own susceptibility to such corruption. The person who recognizes the typical effects of power and privilege is better positioned to resist them through conscious effort and structural safeguards. From Severus, Marcus learned to love his family, to love truth, and to love justice. These three loves provide the foundation for a complete human life. Love of family connects us to our particular relationships and responsibilities. Love of truth ensures that our understanding of the world is based on reality rather than wishful thinking or convenient fictions. Love of justice extends our concern beyond our immediate circle to include the welfare of all people. He also learned from Severus the concept of equality before the law and of government which respects the equal rights of subjects and the freedom of speech. These political principles, revolutionary in their time and still challenging today, reflect the application of Stoic philosophy to practical governance. If all people share in the rational nature that makes them human, then all deserve equal treatment under law, regardless of their social position. The combination of these lessons created the foundation for Marcus's approach to both personal conduct and political leadership. His gratitude toward his teachers reveals recognition that character is not self-created but emerges through relationship and example. Even an emperor exists within a community of influence that extends across generations. These acknowledgments also demonstrate intellectual humility. The person who can recognize their debts to others has avoided the dangerous illusion of self-sufficiency that often accompanies power and success. By beginning his reflections with gratitude, Marcus establishes a framework of relationship and obligation that will inform everything that follows. The specific virtues he learned from each person create a comprehensive curriculum in human excellence that encompasses emotional regulation, intellectual integrity, social responsibility, and spiritual development. Together, they form not just a list of admirable qualities, but a practical program for becoming the kind of person capable of carrying enormous responsibility with wisdom and grace. Chapter 3: The Universe and I, a Life in Harmony with Nature. This foundation of gratitude and relationship naturally opened Marcus's awareness to something even larger. Having recognized his debts to specific teachers and family members, he began to perceive the vast web of connection that extends far beyond human relationships. The emperor who governed the known world came to understand that he himself was governed by forces immeasurably greater than any human authority. In the quiet moments of dawn, when the palace still slept and the weight of imperial decisions had not yet settled upon his shoulders, Marcus would step into his private garden. The morning air carried the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of the Tiber flowing toward the sea. In these precious intervals of solitude, surrounded by the simple persistence of growing things, he contemplated his place within the cosmic order that the Stoics called the Logos. The concept was not merely intellectual for Marcus. Standing among the olive trees his predecessors had planted, watching the predictable dance of seasons that no human decree could alter, he felt viscerally connected to patterns of existence that dwarfed the concerns of courts and campaigns. The same force that guided the migration of birds and the flowering of trees operated within the realm of human affairs. Though people often failed to recognize it, this recognition brought both humility and profound comfort. The man who could command legions and reshape the borders of empire understood that he was simultaneously the most powerful person in his world and utterly dependent upon forces beyond his control. The sun that rose each morning owed nothing to his authority. The rain that nourished the grain that fed Rome fell according to laws that predated human civilization and would continue long after the last emperor had been forgotten. Yet, this was not a source of despair, but of deep relief. The burden of believing oneself responsible for controlling the uncontrollable had lifted from his shoulders. Instead of fighting against the nature of things, Marcus learned to discern the difference between what lay within his power and what did not. This fundamental distinction became the cornerstone of his practical philosophy and his approach to leadership. Within his control lay his judgments, his responses to circumstances, his choices about how to interpret events, and how to act in accordance with his deepest values. These were his true domain, the sphere where he exercised genuine sovereignty. Everything else belonged to the larger order of existence. And his wisdom lay in working harmoniously with that order, rather than against it. This perspective transformed his understanding of adversity. When plague swept through the empire, when barbarian tribes pressed against the northern frontiers, when trusted advisors proved unreliable, Marcus no longer experienced these challenges as personal affronts or evidence that the world had somehow gone wrong. Instead, he saw them as expressions of the natural turbulence that characterizes existence in a material universe. Just as storms arose from the interaction of atmospheric pressures that followed predictable physical laws, human troubles emerged from the collision of competing interests, limited resources, and the inevitable friction that occurs when conscious beings with different perspectives attempt to share the same world. Understanding this pattern allowed Marcus to respond to crises with equanimity rather than indignation. The emperor, who had studied the writings of Epictetus, recognized that his predecessor in philosophical development had been born a slave, yet had achieved a freedom that no external circumstances could touch. This paradox illustrated a profound truth about the relationship between outer conditions and inner state. True liberty existed independently of social status, material possessions, or even physical constraints. Marcus carried this insight into his daily governance of the empire. When rebellious generals challenged his authority, when senators plotted against his policies, when the complexities of ruling a diverse collection of peoples seemed to multiply beyond any possibility of resolution, he remembered that his fundamental task was not to control outcomes but to act in accordance with reason and justice regardless of results. This did not make him passive or resigned. On the contrary, understanding the limits of his control freed him to act with complete commitment within his proper sphere of influence. Like a skilled sailor who cannot command the wind but can adjust the sails and choose the course, Marcus learned to navigate the storms of leadership by focusing entirely on the elements he could actually direct. The distinction between what was up to him and what was not became a practical tool for decision-making. When faced with complex political situations, He would first identify which aspects of the problem fell within his area of genuine influence. These received his complete attention and effort. The remaining elements, those subject to factors beyond his reach, he acknowledged without anxiety or frustration. This approach proved particularly valuable during the long campaigns along the Danube frontier, where he spent the final years of his life defending the empire against successive waves of Germanic tribes. The hardships of military life, the uncertainty of battle, the grief of losing trusted officers and loyal soldiers could have overwhelmed even the most experienced commander. But Marcus had learned to view these trials as opportunities to practice the virtues that his teachers had modeled. Each morning, in his campaign tent, surrounded by the sounds of an army preparing for another day of marching or fighting, he would remind himself that he faced nothing fundamentally different from the challenges that had tested human beings throughout history. The specific details varied, but the essential situation remained constant. People with limited knowledge and conflicting interests had to make difficult decisions under pressure while dealing with loss, uncertainty, and the ever-present reality of mortality. Rather than seeing his circumstances as uniquely burdensome, Marcus recognized them as a particular instance of the universal human condition. This perspective allowed him to draw strength from the examples of countless others who had faced similar trials with courage and wisdom. He was participating in an ancient conversation about how to live well under difficult circumstances, adding his own voice to a tradition that connected him with philosophers, soldiers, and ordinary citizens across the centuries. The physical discomforts of campaign life became opportunities to practice the Stoic discipline of accepting what could not be changed while maintaining focus on proper responses. The cold nights when frost formed inside his tent, the days when rain turned the roads to mud and slowed the army's progress, the moments when supply lines stretched thin and luxuries disappeared entirely, all served as reminders that comfort was not essential for human flourishing. In these conditions, Marcus discovered that his capacity for contentment did not depend upon external circumstances, but upon his internal orientation toward those circumstances. The emperor who slept on a simple cot in a drafty tent could experience the same fundamental peace he had known in the marble halls of the palace, provided he maintained proper perspective on what truly mattered. This insight gradually reshaped his understanding of pleasure and pain, success and failure, praise and criticism. All of these experiences were temporary fluctuations in the surface conditions of life, no more significant in themselves than changes in weather. What mattered was how he chose to interpret and respond to them, whether he used them as occasions for practicing virtue or allowed them to disturb his equilibrium. The emperor's growing wisdom about the relationship between inner state and outer circumstances reflected a deeper truth about human nature that the Stoics had long recognized. People were designed to find fulfillment not through obtaining particular external conditions, but through the exercise of their distinctive capacities for reason, choice, and moral action. Like musicians who found satisfaction in playing their instruments well regardless of the audience's response, human beings could discover genuine happiness through the skillful use of their unique abilities. This recognition freed Marcus from the exhausting pursuit of controlling other people's responses to his leadership. He could govern according to his best understanding of justice and the common good without requiring universal approval or even understanding of his decisions. The opinions of others became information to consider rather than verdicts on his worth as a person or a ruler. Chapter 4: Contemplating Death, Understanding Impermanence, and the Eternal. As Marcus deepened his understanding of inner freedom, he found himself drawn increasingly to contemplate the most fundamental aspect of human existence that no external circumstance could alter: the certainty of death. This contemplation was not morbid fascination, but rather a practical exercise in wisdom, a way of achieving the proper perspective on life's temporary nature that would allow him to live more fully in each present moment. The emperor's meditations on mortality began not with abstract philosophical propositions, but with direct observation of the world around him. He watched the seasonal cycles in the palace gardens, noting how spring's vibrant blooms gave way to summer's maturity, then to autumn's decline, and finally to winter's apparent death that would nurture the next year's renewal. Each phase was complete in itself, neither hurrying toward the next nor clinging to what had passed. This natural rhythm offered Marcus a template for understanding human life. Just as no reasonable person would expect a rose to bloom indefinitely or condemn winter for following autumn, there was a fundamental misunderstanding in treating death as an enemy rather than the natural conclusion of life's arc. The emperor began to see that much of human suffering arose from this basic resistance to the natural order, this persistent wish that temporary things might somehow become permanent. In his private moments of reflection, Marcus would often recall specific individuals who had once seemed permanent fixtures of Roman life but who had passed into memory. Generals who had commanded vast armies, senators whose voices had once filled the forum with passionate rhetoric, artists whose works had captivated the entire empire, all had eventually yielded to the same inevitable transition that awaited him. Their deaths had not diminished the value of their contributions, but had simply marked the completion of their particular roles in the great human drama. This recognition led the emperor to a profound shift in how he approached his daily responsibilities. Rather than seeking to build monuments to his own permanence or to secure a legacy that would indefinitely preserve his name and achievements, he began to focus on performing each duty with complete attention and care, knowing that the quality of his actions mattered more than their duration or their remembered impact. Marcus discovered that accepting death's inevitability paradoxically enhanced rather than diminished his engagement with life. When he truly internalized that his time was limited and precious, every conversation with his children became more meaningful. Every decision about imperial policy gained sharper focus. Every moment of beauty observed in nature registered with greater intensity. The knowledge of impermanence served as a lens that brought the present moment into crystal clarity. The emperor's contemplation of death also transformed his relationship with fear. He observed that most of his anxieties arose from imagined future scenarios in which he might lose something he currently possessed or fail to obtain something he desired. But death was the ultimate loss of everything external, the final failure to maintain any earthly possession or achievement. By regularly contemplating this ultimate letting go, smaller losses and disappointments began to seem less threatening. Marcus found himself developing what he privately called the view from the end, a practice of imagining himself in his final moments and considering what would truly matter from that perspective. Would he regret having spent too much time worrying about the criticism of political opponents? Would he wish he had accumulated more wealth or conquered more territory? Or would he find satisfaction in having treated people justly, having acted according to his deepest convictions, and having contributed to the welfare of the Roman people to the best of his ability? This perspective exercise became a powerful tool for decision-making. When faced with choices between immediate pleasure and long-term virtue, between popular approval and principled action, between personal gain and public service, the emperor would ask himself which option would seem wise when viewed from his deathbed. The answer was almost always clear, and it consistently pointed toward the more challenging but ultimately more meaningful path. The practice also helped Marcus understand the relationship between individual mortality and the continuity of human civilization. While his own life was temporary, the institutions he served, the values he tried to embody, and the positive changes he worked to implement could outlive his physical existence. This recognition allowed him to invest deeply in projects and reforms whose benefits he might never personally witness, finding motivation not in immediate reward but in the knowledge that his efforts could contribute to the flourishing of future generations. Marcus began to see death not as an interruption of life but as its natural completion, like the final note that gives meaning to an entire musical composition. Just as a melody's beauty was not diminished by its ending but rather enhanced by the way each note led purposefully toward its conclusion, a human life could achieve completeness and satisfaction through the conscious integration of mortality into every aspect of living. This understanding gradually freed the emperor from the exhausting attempt to control outcomes beyond his influence. If death would eventually claim all external achievements, regardless of his efforts to preserve them, then his energy was better spent on the aspects of existence that remained within his control. His choices, his responses to circumstances, and his commitment to virtue. These internal elements could be perfected regardless of external conditions and would retain their value even in the face of mortality. The emperor's deepened awareness of impermanence also enhanced his appreciation for the present moment. Knowing that his current experience of consciousness, sensation, and relationship was temporary made each instance more precious rather than less significant. The taste of bread became more vivid when considered as one of a limited number of such experiences. The sight of sunlight streaming through palace windows gained beauty from the knowledge that he would witness this scene only a finite number of times. Marcus discovered that this heightened presence was not a burden but a gift. When he fully accepted that nothing in his external circumstances was guaranteed to continue, he could experience genuine gratitude for what was actually present rather than taking it for granted or spending his mental energy worrying about its potential loss. The temporary nature of all experiences became a source of wonder rather than anxiety. Through sustained contemplation of mortality, the emperor developed what he came to think of as death's wisdom, a perspective that helped him distinguish between what was truly important and what was merely urgent or appealing. Death's inevitability served as a filter that separated lasting values from temporary concerns, essential relationships from superficial connections, meaningful work from busy distractions. This wisdom manifested in practical changes to how Marcus structured his days and allocated his attention. He spent more time in direct conversation with his children, less time in ceremonial functions that served primarily to reinforce his status. He devoted more energy to understanding the real needs of the Roman people, less to managing his public image. He pursued philosophical study and self-reflection more seriously, while reducing his involvement in political intrigues that would ultimately prove meaningless. The emperor's acceptance of mortality also transformed his relationship with pain and difficulty. If death was the ultimate challenge that no one could avoid through cleverness or strength, then smaller hardships became opportunities to practice the courage and resilience that would be needed for that final test. Physical discomfort, political setbacks, and personal disappointments could all serve as training exercises for the ultimate letting go that death would require. Marcus began to understand that learning to die well was actually learning to live well, since both required the same fundamental skill, the ability to remain centered and purposeful while accepting what could not be changed. The emperor who could face death with equanimity was the same emperor who could govern effectively amid uncertainty, who could maintain his principles under pressure, and who could find meaning and satisfaction regardless of external circumstances. This profound acceptance of life's temporary nature became the foundation for a kind of freedom that no external authority could threaten or remove. When Marcus truly internalized that death would eventually claim everything he possessed, including his own body and mind, he discovered a lightness and spontaneity that enhanced rather than diminished his effectiveness as both a ruler and a human being. The knowledge of impermanence had become, paradoxically, a source of enduring peace. Chapter 5. The Inner Citadel, Freedom and Serenity of Mind. This deep understanding of impermanence naturally led Marcus to explore another fundamental aspect of Stoic philosophy, the cultivation of an inner sanctuary that remained unshakable regardless of external turbulence. The emperor discovered that, while he could not control the storms that raged around his empire, he possessed absolute sovereignty over a sacred space within his own consciousness. The concept of this inner citadel was not merely philosophical abstraction for Marcus, but a practical reality he experienced during the most challenging moments of his reign. When barbarian tribes threatened the northern borders and plague swept through his territories, When trusted advisors betrayed him and senators schemed behind closed doors, Marcus found that he could retreat into this internal fortress where clarity and purpose remained undisturbed. This inner sanctuary was built not from stone and mortar, but from carefully cultivated habits of thought and disciplined responses to adversity. Marcus learned to recognize the difference between what happened to him and his interpretation of what happened. External events might be beyond his control, but his response to those events remained entirely within his power. This distinction became the foundation upon which his psychological freedom rested. The emperor often reflected on how his predecessors had sought security through military might, political alliances, and vast treasures. Yet Marcus observed that such external securities proved fragile when truly tested. Armies could be defeated, allies could betray, and wealth could vanish overnight. But the security that came from inner discipline and philosophical understanding could not be taken by any enemy or lost through any misfortune. Marcus began to understand that true strength lay not in the ability to dominate external circumstances, but in the capacity to remain centered and purposeful, regardless of how those circumstances unfolded. This realization transformed his approach to governance and personal conduct alike. Rather than expending energy trying to control outcomes that lay beyond his influence, he focused his efforts on maintaining the quality of his own thoughts, intentions, and responses. The practice of maintaining this inner fortress required constant vigilance and regular exercise. Marcus developed specific mental disciplines that strengthened his psychological resilience. When faced with disappointing news or unexpected setbacks, he would pause before reacting and ask himself whether the situation truly warranted emotional disturbance or whether his peace of mind was more valuable than any temporary satisfaction that might come from anger or frustration. This approach did not make Marcus passive or indifferent to his responsibilities. Instead, it allowed him to engage with challenges more effectively because his actions arose from clear thinking rather than emotional turbulence. When the emperor could maintain inner calm amid chaos, he could see opportunities that remained hidden to those whose judgment was clouded by anxiety or rage. The inner citadel also protected Marcus from the particular vulnerabilities that came with absolute power. He observed how many rulers became prisoners of their own position, constantly worried about threats to their authority and consumed by the need to maintain their image. But when the emperor's sense of security came from within rather than from external validation, he could act according to his principles rather than according to political expediency. Marcus discovered that this inner freedom paradoxically made him more effective in his external duties. When he was not dependent on particular outcomes for his peace of mind, he could pursue the right course of action without being paralyzed by fear of failure or distracted by hope of reward. The emperor, who had learned to find satisfaction in the quality of his effort rather than in the results of that effort, could maintain consistency and integrity even in the most challenging circumstances. This philosophical stance also transformed Marcus's relationship with praise and criticism. When courtiers flattered him or enemies denounced him, he could evaluate their words based on their truth value rather than their emotional impact. The emperor, who had built his sense of worth on the foundation of his own character rather than on others' opinions, could receive feedback with equanimity and respond with wisdom rather than defensiveness or pride. The development of inner strength also enabled Marcus to face physical discomfort and material deprivation with greater resilience. During long military campaigns, when he lived in simple tents and ate basic provisions, the emperor found that his happiness remained largely unchanged from his experiences in the luxurious palace. This realization freed him from the anxiety that many wealthy and powerful people experience about potentially losing their comforts and privileges. Marcus began to understand that most human suffering came not from external hardships themselves, but from the mental resistance to those hardships. When he could accept difficult circumstances without demanding that they be different, he could focus his energy on responding constructively rather than wasting it on futile wishes that reality might be otherwise. This acceptance did not mean resignation or passive surrender. but rather a clear-eyed recognition of what was actually possible to change. The emperor's inner fortress was built through daily practices of reflection and self-examination. Each morning, Marcus would spend time reminding himself of the principles that would guide his actions throughout the day. Each evening, he would review his responses to the day's challenges and consider how he might handle similar situations with greater wisdom in the future. These practices gradually strengthened his capacity to maintain perspective and purpose regardless of external pressures. Marcus also found that this inner strength allowed him to be more genuinely helpful to others. When his own peace of mind was not dependent on receiving gratitude or recognition, he could serve others more selflessly. When his sense of security was not threatened by others' problems, he could listen to their concerns with greater attention and respond with more genuine compassion. The emperor discovered that the inner citadel was not a place of isolation, but rather the foundation for more authentic connection with others. When he was not constantly defending his ego or seeking validation, he could engage with people more openly and honestly. The ruler who had found peace within himself could offer that peace to others through his presence and his actions. This internal sanctuary also provided Marcus with a refuge during times of grief and loss. When loved ones died or cherished plans failed, he could retreat to this inner space where the meaning and value of his life did not depend on any particular person or outcome continuing unchanged. This did not diminish his love for others or his commitment to his goals, but it prevented temporary losses from destroying his overall sense of purpose and well-being. The cultivation of inner strength ultimately became for Marcus both a personal practice and a form of service to his empire. The emperor who could maintain his own equilibrium during crises provided stability for his subjects as well. When the ruler was not swept away by the emotions of the moment, he could make decisions based on long-term consequences rather than immediate pressures. Marcus came to understand that the inner citadel was not something he built once and then possessed forever, but rather a space that required ongoing maintenance and protection. External pressures constantly challenged his peace of mind, and internal habits of worry or anger threatened to undermine his psychological freedom. The emperor learned that maintaining his inner fortress was a daily responsibility that required the same attention and discipline as governing his empire. Through years of practice, Marcus found that his inner sanctuary became more spacious and more secure. What had once required conscious effort and deliberate choice gradually became more natural and automatic. The emperor, who had trained himself to respond to challenges with wisdom rather than emotion, discovered that this philosophical stance enhanced every aspect of his life, from his most intimate relationships to his most public responsibilities. This inner freedom ultimately became the foundation for a kind of joy that was independent of circumstances. When Marcus's happiness was not dependent on external conditions being favorable, he could find satisfaction and meaning even during the most difficult periods of his reign. The emperor had discovered that the greatest treasure was not gold or territory, but the peace of mind that came from living according to his deepest values, regardless of the costs or rewards that such living might bring. Chapter 6. The Common Good, Our Shared Responsibility. Yet this inner peace, as profound as it was, could never exist in isolation. Marcus understood that the human soul, no matter how well fortified against external storms, was fundamentally designed for connection and service. The emperor, who had mastered his own thoughts and emotions, faced an even greater challenge: how to use this inner strength not merely for personal tranquility, but for the welfare of all those under his care. As Marcus walked through the corridors of the palace in the early morning hours, when the marble floors were still cool from the night air and the servants moved quietly about their duties, he reflected on the profound interconnectedness of all human life. Each person he encountered, from the lowest slave to the most distinguished senator, was part of an intricate web of relationships and dependencies. The bread that appeared on his table required the labor of farmers, millers, and bakers. The scrolls that brought him news from distant provinces were carried by messengers who risked their lives crossing dangerous territories. This awareness of interdependence was not merely an intellectual understanding for Marcus, but a felt reality that shaped every decision he made as emperor. When he considered new legislation or military campaigns, he carried in his mind the faces of ordinary citizens whose lives would be affected by his choices. The widow struggling to feed her children, the merchant worried about bandit attacks on trade routes, the soldier far from home serving Rome's interests. These were not abstract concepts but real human beings whose suffering or flourishing depended partly on his wisdom and judgment. The emperor discovered that recognizing his role as part of a larger whole actually enhanced rather than diminished his sense of personal purpose. Just as a hand finds its meaning in serving the body, or an eye realizes its nature through enabling sight, Marcus found that his individual identity was most fully expressed when he served something greater than himself. This service was not a burden imposed from outside, but the natural flowering of his deepest nature as a rational, social being. In his private moments of reflection, Marcus often contemplated the image of Rome itself as a single living organism. The emperor was perhaps the head, responsible for thinking and planning, but he was utterly dependent on countless other parts to carry out his intentions. The senators were like the voice, expressing the will of the state. The soldiers were the strong arms that protected the body from harm. The farmers and craftsmen were the hands that produced what was needed for life. Even the humblest citizens played essential roles, like the blood that carries nutrients to every part of the body. This organic vision of society helped Marcus understand that his own well-being was inseparable from the health of the entire empire. When any part of the Roman world suffered, the whole was diminished. When injustice flourished in distant provinces, the moral fabric of the entire state was weakened. When corruption infected the bureaucracy, the emperor's own integrity was compromised. Marcus learned to see social problems not as external difficulties to be managed, but as symptoms of illness in a body of which he was an integral part. The practical implications of this philosophy were far-reaching. Marcus approached governance not as the exercise of power over others, but as a form of care for a larger self, of which he was a part. When he considered the needs of the empire, he tried to think as a physician would when treating a patient. What was needed for health? Where were the sources of disease or weakness? How could the body politic be strengthened without causing harm to any of its parts? This perspective required Marcus to balance competing interests and needs with extraordinary sensitivity. The demands of the military for resources had to be weighed against the needs of citizens for peace and prosperity. The desires of wealthy merchants for favorable trade policies had to be considered alongside the struggles of poor farmers trying to survive economic hardships. The emperor, who saw himself as servant rather than master, found that every decision required careful attention to justice and the common good. Marcus discovered that serving others actually multiplied his own sense of fulfillment rather than depleting it. When he used his position to protect the vulnerable, to promote justice, or to improve the conditions of ordinary people's lives, he experienced a satisfaction far deeper than any pleasure that came from personal indulgence. The emperor learned that happiness was not a private possession to be hoarded, but something that grew when shared and diminished when kept to oneself. The daily practice of governance became for Marcus a form of spiritual exercise. Each audience with petitioners, each review of legal cases, each meeting with advisors was an opportunity to embody the philosophical principles he had studied and internalized. The emperor, who had trained himself to respond to personal challenges with wisdom and equanimity, found that these same qualities served him well in addressing the complex problems of statecraft. In his dealings with foreign ambassadors, Marcus approached negotiations not as zero-sum competitions where one party's gain required another's loss, but as opportunities to find solutions that could benefit all involved. He understood that Rome's long-term security and prosperity depended not on dominating other peoples, but but on creating relationships of mutual respect and benefit. The emperor, who had learned to see beyond his own immediate interests in personal matters, applied this same expansive vision to international affairs. Marcus found that his commitment to the common good actually made him a more effective leader. When people sensed that he genuinely cared about their welfare rather than his own glory, they were more willing to support difficult but necessary policies. When soldiers knew that their emperor shared their hardships and understood their sacrifices, they fought with greater courage and dedication. When citizens observed that their ruler lived simply despite having access to unlimited luxury, they were more willing to accept their own responsibilities and limitations. The emperor's example became as important as his commands. Marcus realized that people learned more from observing how their leaders behaved than from listening to their speeches or reading their proclamations. When he treated even the humblest petitioners with respect and attention, this demonstrated the value of human dignity more powerfully than any philosophical treatise. When he accepted criticism gracefully and changed his mind when presented with better arguments, this showed the importance of intellectual humility and openness to truth. Through years of practice, Marcus developed what he came to think of as an enlarged sense of self. His identity expanded beyond the boundaries of his individual body and mind to include all those whose lives he touched through his decisions and example. This was not a loss of personal identity, but rather its fulfillment in a larger context. The emperor, who had learned to master his private thoughts and emotions, found that using this mastery in service of others was the natural completion of his philosophical development. This expansion of identity brought with it a profound shift in how Marcus understood success and failure. Personal achievements that benefited only himself came to seem hollow and meaningless. Setbacks that advanced the larger good, even at cost to his own comfort or reputation, felt like genuine victories. The emperor learned to measure his life not by what he had accumulated or accomplished for himself, but by how much he had contributed to the flourishing of the human community of which he was part. In quiet moments, as Marcus looked out over the city of Rome from his private study, he often reflected on the countless lives unfolding beneath the roofs he could see. In each house were human beings facing their own struggles and joys, their own challenges and opportunities for growth. The emperor, who had once focused primarily on his own spiritual development, now found his greatest satisfaction in knowing that his choices and actions were creating conditions that allowed others to pursue their own paths toward wisdom, virtue, and happiness. This vision of leadership as service had transformed not only Marcus's approach to governance, but his entire understanding of what it meant to live a meaningful life. He had discovered that the goal of philosophy was not merely personal tranquility or individual perfection, but the cultivation of wisdom and virtue that could be shared with others and passed on to future generations. The emperor, who had begun his philosophical journey seeking inner peace, had found something far greater, a sense of purpose that connected his individual life to the vast sweep of human history and the endless potential for human flourishing. Chapter 7. Living in the Present, the Power of the Moment. Yet even with this profound understanding of his role in the larger tapestry of human existence, Marcus still found himself wrestling with one of the most persistent challenges of the human condition: the tendency of the mind to drift away from the present moment. Despite all his philosophical training and hard-won wisdom, he noticed how easily his thoughts would slip backward into regret over past decisions, or forward into anxiety about future challenges. The emperor, who had mastered the art of governance, still struggled with mastering the restless wanderings of his own consciousness. During his morning walks through the palace gardens, Marcus began to observe this pattern with the same careful attention he brought to matters of state. He noticed how his mind would suddenly transport him to a conversation from years past, replaying words he wished he had spoken differently or decisions he wondered if he should have made another way. These mental journeys into the past served no constructive purpose, yet they seemed to happen without his conscious invitation. pulling his attention away from the beauty of the roses blooming around him or the warmth of the morning sun on his face. Equally distracting were his mind's excursions into imagined futures. As emperor, Marcus carried the weight of countless responsibilities that extended far beyond the present day. Planning for military campaigns, considering the long-term effects of new laws, thinking through the succession of leadership all required him to project his thinking forward in time. Yet he began to recognize the difference between purposeful planning and anxious speculation about things that might never come to pass. Too often, he realized, his mind would create elaborate scenarios of potential disasters or complications, generating genuine stress about events that existed only in his imagination. This recognition led Marcus to one of his most important philosophical insights, that while the past and future certainly existed as concepts and had practical importance for planning and learning, they had no real existence in the actual moment of living. The past was nothing more than memory, and memory was simply present moment thoughts about things that had already happened. The future was nothing more than anticipation, and anticipation was simply present moment thoughts about things that might happen. In both cases, the actual experience was happening now, in this moment, yet his attention was focused on mental constructs rather than present reality. The emperor began to experiment with different practices for cultivating what he came to think of as presence of mind. During state meetings, instead of allowing his attention to drift to the next item on his agenda while listening to advisors, he practiced giving his full attention to the person speaking, really hearing not just their words but the concerns and hopes behind those words. He found that this quality of attention not only made him a more effective leader but brought a richness to these interactions that he had previously missed in his hurry to move through his responsibilities. In his private study, Marcus developed the habit of periodically pausing in his reading or writing to simply notice his immediate experience. He would feel the weight of the scroll in his hands, observe the quality of light coming through the window, or become aware of the subtle sounds of the palace around him. These moments of presence felt like coming home to himself after being lost in a maze of thoughts and concerns. They reminded him that life was not happening in his memories or his plans, but right here, right now, in the simple fact of his breathing, his sitting, his being alive in this particular moment. The practice revealed something profound about the nature of suffering. Marcus began to see that most of his mental distress came not from his actual present circumstances, but from his thoughts about those circumstances. When he was fully present, dealing directly with whatever situation faced him, he felt capable and engaged. It was only when his mind began creating stories about why the situation was problematic, how it might lead to future difficulties, or how it connected to past failures, that he experienced the familiar weight of anxiety and frustration. This insight transformed his approach to the inevitable challenges that came with leadership. When faced with news of problems in distant provinces or conflicts with neighboring territories, Marcus learned to distinguish between the actual facts of the situation and his mental elaborations about those facts. The facts themselves, he discovered, were usually manageable when addressed directly and thoughtfully. It was his mind's tendency to amplify them with worry, to project them into catastrophic future scenarios, or to connect them to past failures that made them feel overwhelming. The emperor found particular wisdom in observing the natural world around him. Trees, he noticed, did not waste energy regretting their growth from previous seasons or worrying about whether they would survive future droughts. They simply put all their life force into the process of growing right now, in response to present conditions. Birds did not appear anxious about whether they would find food tomorrow. They focused completely on the immediate task of finding food today. The sun did not seem concerned about whether it had shone brightly enough yesterday or whether clouds might block it tomorrow. It simply shone with full intensity in each moment it was able. These observations from nature helped Marcus understand that presence was not just a useful practice, but actually the most natural and efficient way to live. When his attention was scattered across past and future, his energy was divided and his effectiveness diminished. When his attention was gathered in the present moment, he could bring his full intelligence and capability to bear on whatever required his attention. Paradoxically, this present-focused approach made him more effective at planning for the future and learning from the past, because he could give these activities his complete attention when they were actually necessary rather than having them constantly interrupt his engagement with immediate reality. The practice of presence also deepened Marcus's appreciation for the ordinary moments of his life. Previously, he had moved through routine activities like eating, walking, or bathing in a somewhat mechanical way, his mind occupied with more apparently important matters. As he learned to bring his full attention to these simple activities, he discovered they contained their own forms of richness and satisfaction. The taste of bread became more vivid, the sensation of water more refreshing, the simple pleasure of movement more energizing. This heightened awareness of ordinary experience led to one of Marcus's most cherished realizations, that every moment contained the potential for fulfillment and meaning, regardless of whether anything particularly significant was happening. The emperor, who had once thought that meaning came only through great achievements and important decisions, discovered that meaning was actually woven through the fabric of every day, available to anyone who learned to pay attention to the gift of present experience. Marcus began to see that his earlier conception of philosophical practice had been somewhat incomplete. He had focused primarily on developing the right ideas about life, cultivating proper attitudes toward success and failure, and learning to align his actions with virtue and wisdom. These remained important, but he now understood that the foundation of all philosophical practice was simply learning to be fully present to life as it was actually happening. Without this foundation of presence, even the wisest ideas remained somewhat abstract and disconnected from lived experience. The emperor's growing mastery of present moment awareness began to influence every aspect of his leadership and personal life. In conversations with his family, instead of partially listening while mentally reviewing his duties, he learned to be completely available to his wife and children. This quality of attention strengthened his relationships and gave him access to forms of joy and connection that had been available all along, but that he had been too distracted to notice. In his governance, present moment awareness allowed him to perceive subtle currents of mood and opinion among his advisors and citizens that helped him make more nuanced and effective decisions. Perhaps most significantly, this practice of presence began to dissolve Marcus's sense of being burdened by the weight of his responsibilities. When he approached his duties with full attention rather than anxiety about their implications, even the most challenging aspects of leadership became manageable and sometimes even enjoyable. The emperor discovered that presence was not just a way of reducing stress, but actually a path to finding satisfaction and meaning in whatever circumstances life presented. As Marcus continued to develop this capacity for present moment awareness, he realized he had found the key to what philosophers had long sought, a way of living that was both deeply peaceful and fully engaged with the world. By learning to inhabit each moment completely, he had discovered that the present contained everything necessary for a meaningful life. This insight would become one of his most treasured philosophical discoveries, a practical wisdom that could transform any moment from a stepping stone to somewhere else into a destination worthy of full appreciation and attention. Chapter 8: The Light of Reason, Standards of Wise Judgment. This deepening awareness of the present moment naturally led Marcus to examine the very foundation of his thinking itself. He began to notice how his mind, like a restless wind, could shift from clarity to confusion in moments. The emperor observed that his judgments were often clouded by immediate emotions, past grievances, or future anxieties. Standing in his private study one evening, watching the oil lamps flicker against the stone walls, he recognized that true wisdom required something more deliberate than spontaneous reaction. The emperor had always prided himself on his rational approach to governance, yet he was beginning to see how often his reasoning was actually a sophisticated form of justification for decisions already made by his emotions. When a provincial governor disappointed him, Marcus noticed his mind would immediately begin constructing logical arguments for punishment, even before he had fully examined the circumstances. When his military advisors brought news of border conflicts, he observed his heart racing with anxiety while his mind scrambled to find rational responses to emotional turbulence. This recognition became the starting point for what Marcus would come to consider his most practical philosophical discipline. He began to train himself to pause between stimulus and response, creating a small space where genuine reasoning could occur. Initially, this pause lasted only a few seconds, but even this brief interval allowed him to ask himself a simple question that changed everything. What would a perfectly rational person think about this situation? The question itself became a kind of internal compass. When faced with a citizen's complaint about taxation, instead of immediately defending imperial policy or dismissing the grievance, Marcus learned to step back mentally and examine the situation as if he were an impartial observer. This practice revealed how often his initial reactions were driven by pride, defensiveness, or the simple desire to maintain the status quo, rather than by genuine concern for justice or the common good. One particular incident illuminated the power of this approach. A young senator had publicly criticized one of Marcus's recent edicts, suggesting that the emperor was out of touch with the struggles of common citizens. Marcus felt his face flush with anger, and his mind immediately began formulating a sharp response that would put the young man in his place. But instead of speaking, he created that pause he had been practicing. In that moment of stillness, Marcus asked himself what a truly wise ruler would think about such criticism. The rational perspective that emerged surprised him. A wise leader, he realized, would be grateful for honest feedback rather than defensive about his authority. The young senator's words, examined objectively, contained valid concerns about how imperial policies affected daily life in Rome. Marcus's anger, he saw, was really just wounded pride, masquerading as righteous indignation. This insight transformed what could have been an embarrassing confrontation into a meaningful dialogue. Marcus thanked the senator for his candor and invited him to elaborate on his observations. The conversation that followed provided the emperor with valuable information about the real impact of his policies and began a relationship that would prove beneficial to the empire for years to come. The emperor began to apply this same rational examination to his private thoughts and feelings. When he found himself resenting the endless demands of leadership, he would pause and ask what a reasonable person would think about his situation. The rational perspective invariably reminded him that his position was both a privilege and a responsibility that billions of people would never have the opportunity to experience. His resentment, viewed objectively, seemed like the complaint of someone who had forgotten how fortunate he was to be able to serve in such a meaningful capacity. Marcus discovered that this practice of rational examination was particularly powerful when applied to his judgments about other people. His initial impressions of individuals were often influenced by their appearance, social status, or how they had treated him in previous encounters. But when he paused to consider what a fair-minded person would think, focusing only on observable behaviors and demonstrated character, his assessments became both more accurate and more compassionate. A gruff military commander who had initially struck Marcus as hostile and uncooperative revealed himself, upon rational examination, to be a dedicated soldier struggling with personal grief over fallen comrades. A wealthy merchant who seemed arrogant and self-serving turned out to be a man desperately trying to maintain his family's honor after a series of financial setbacks. By learning to see people through the lens of reason rather than immediate emotional reaction, Marcus found his relationships becoming more genuine and his leadership more effective. The emperor also began to notice patterns in his thinking that consistently led him away from rational judgment. He observed that he was more likely to make poor decisions when he was hungry, tired, or feeling overwhelmed by the sheer volume of his responsibilities. This awareness allowed him to build simple practices into his daily routine that supported clearer thinking. He made sure to eat regular meals, to get adequate rest, and to take brief moments of quiet reflection between major decisions. Perhaps most importantly, Marcus learned to distinguish between thoughts that arose from careful reasoning and those that simply reflected his current emotional state. When anxiety made problems seem insurmountable, rational examination usually revealed practical steps that could be taken. When anger made others seem unreasonable or malicious, objective analysis often uncovered understandable motivations for their behavior. When sadness made life seem meaningless, logical reflection reminded him of the countless ways his actions contributed to human flourishing. This development of rational judgment did not make Marcus cold or calculating. Instead, it freed him to respond to situations with appropriate emotions based on accurate understanding rather than reactive feelings based on incomplete information. When genuine injustice occurred, his anger was clean and focused rather than tangled with personal offense. When real tragedy struck, his grief was pure rather than complicated by self-pity or resentment. The emperor found that rational thinking was not the enemy of feeling, but rather the foundation for authentic emotion. By learning to see situations clearly, he was able to respond to them with the full depth of human feeling while avoiding the confusion and suffering that came from reacting to his own projections and assumptions rather than to reality itself. Chapter 9. The Flowing River, Embracing Life's Constant Change. This clarity of thought prepared Marcus to face perhaps the most fundamental truth of existence, the truth that everything he knew, everything he loved, and everything he feared would eventually pass away. Standing in the gardens of his palace one morning, watching the autumn leaves spiral down from the oak trees, he reflected on how every aspect of life participated in this endless dance of transformation. The leaves that now carpeted the ground had once been tender green, shoots reaching toward spring sunlight. The mighty oak itself had grown from a tiny acorn, weathered countless storms, and would someday return to the earth that nourished it. Even the marble columns of his palace, seemingly eternal in their grandeur, were slowly yielding to wind and rain, their surfaces imperceptibly wearing away grain by grain. Marcus found profound comfort in recognizing that this impermanence was not a flaw in the design of existence, but rather its most essential feature. Like a river that maintained its character while its waters constantly flowed and renewed themselves, life sustained itself through perpetual change. The emperor who tried to hold back this flow would be as foolish as a man attempting to stop the Tiber with his bare hands. He observed this principle operating within his own body and mind. The cells that comprised his flesh were continuously dying and being replaced, so that the physical form he inhabited today shared little material substance with the body he had possessed as a young man. His thoughts, too, arose and dissolved like clouds in an endless sky, each idea giving way to the next in an unbroken stream of consciousness. Even his closest relationships embodied this truth of constant transformation. The wife he loved today was not precisely the same woman he had married years before, nor was he the same man who had spoken those wedding vows. They had both grown, changed, and evolved, their love deepening not despite these changes but because of them. Their relationship remained vital, precisely because it adapted to accommodate their individual transformations. Marcus came to understand that resistance to change was the source of most human suffering. When people clung desperately to circumstances, relationships, or versions of themselves that were naturally evolving, they created unnecessary friction with the fundamental grain of reality. It was like trying to hold water in cupped hands, the very act of grasping causing what they sought to preserve to slip away more quickly. The emperor learned to practice what he called the art of graceful release. When favorite advisors left his service for other opportunities, he blessed their departure rather than resenting their choice. When age began to limit his physical capabilities, he adapted his activities rather than raging against his body's natural evolution. When political circumstances required him to abandon cherished plans, he adjusted his strategies rather than mourning what could not be. This did not mean becoming passive or indifferent to outcomes, Marcus continued to work diligently toward his goals and to care deeply about the welfare of his empire and his loved ones. But he held these concerns lightly, like a skilled horseman who maintains firm control of his mount while remaining relaxed and responsive to changing terrain. He discovered that acceptance of impermanence actually enhanced his appreciation for present experiences. Knowing that his conversations with his children would not continue forever made each exchange more precious. Understanding that his reign would eventually end motivated him to use his power wisely while he possessed it. Recognizing that his own life was finite filled each day with significance and urgency. The emperor found particular wisdom in observing the cycles of nature that surrounded him. Spring's burst of new growth emerged from winter's apparent death, demonstrating that endings often contained the seeds of fresh beginnings. Summer's abundance naturally gave way to autumn's harvest, showing that peaks of achievement were meant to be enjoyed rather than permanently maintained. Winter's dormancy prepared the ground for spring's renewal, proving that periods of apparent inactivity served essential purposes in larger cycles of development. Marcus applied these insights to the challenges facing his empire. When barbarian invasions disrupted established trade routes, new forms of commerce emerged. When plagues devastated certain regions, survivors often developed stronger communities and more resilient institutions. When traditional approaches to governance proved inadequate for changing circumstances, innovative solutions arose from the necessity of adaptation. The emperor began to see his role not as a guardian of rigid traditions, but as a facilitator of beneficial change. He maintained the empire's essential character while allowing its structures to evolve in response to new realities. This required considerable wisdom to distinguish between core principles that should be preserved and specific practices that needed modification or abandonment. Through years of contemplating impermanence, Marcus developed an almost mystical appreciation for the interconnectedness of all things. Each ending enabled multiple new beginnings. Every death nourished countless forms of life, and all apparent losses revealed themselves as transformations when viewed from a sufficiently broad perspective. He came to understand that his individual existence was like a single note in an infinite symphony, meaningful not in isolation but as part of a vast, ever-changing composition that encompassed all of creation. Chapter 10: Eternal Legacy. The Meditations' Enduring Message. As Marcus contemplated his approaching death, he reflected on the profound transformation his daily practice of self-examination had brought to his understanding of human existence. The private journal entries that had begun as exercises in Stoic discipline had evolved into something far more significant than he had ever anticipated. Through years of wrestling with the fundamental questions of mortality, duty, and meaning, he had discovered that true wisdom lay not in finding perfect answers, but in learning to ask increasingly profound questions. The emperor's final meditations revealed his deepest insight that each individual possesses an infinite capacity for growth and renewal, regardless of external circumstances. He had observed this truth countless times in his own life, watching himself overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges through patient application of philosophical principles. The same resilience that enabled him to govern a vast empire during tumultuous times also sustained ordinary citizens who faced their own daily struggles with courage and dignity. Marcus understood that the thoughts he had recorded in solitude would outlive his physical form, carrying forward the essential message that human beings could transcend their limitations through disciplined reflection and virtuous action. The wisdom contained within his private musings represented not merely his personal philosophy, but the accumulated insights of countless generations who had grappled with the eternal questions of how to live well in an uncertain world. His meditations would continue to offer guidance long after the Roman Empire itself had crumbled into dust, speaking directly to the universal human experience of seeking meaning amid impermanence.